Hi folks. Before we get into this episode, I want to talk about UK True Crime Podcast. It's a podcast which focuses on the lesser known crimes which have taken place primarily in the UK, and it also offers new perspectives and insights into stories you may already know. It's hosted by Adam, and if you like the style of the Troubles podcast, then this one is for you, with his delivery being direct and straight to the point. With a library of over 300 episodes, there are plenty to check out. And he also has some relating to the Troubles as well. You can listen by searching UK True Crime Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Now, let's get into it. April in the year 2023 is the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, or Belfast Agreement as it's referred to by Unionists. This agreement was not the first attempt to end the seemingly never-ending cycle of violence, but it was the one which more or less got everyone on board and over the line of peace. In the first few years of the signing, there were some significant challenges, as some dissident paramilitary groups wanted to continue their campaign of violence. And though spates of violence have continued to spring up from time to time, for the most part there has been peace in Northern Ireland. But has there been unity? In this lofty episode, we will learn about all aspects of the Good Friday Agreement and just how difficult it was to meet the needs of all parties involved. We will also look into the legacy of the agreement and what happened in the years since it was signed. So let's get into it then. This is the Troubles podcast, a podcast which explores the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement was by no means the first attempt at brokering peace in Northern Ireland during the period of conflict known as the Troubles. The first attempt was in 1973 and was known as the Sunningdale Agreement. This agreement proposed that Unionists and Nationalists would share power in the government. This would give Nationalists cabinet positions for the first time and hopefully restore peace. The agreement would also facilitate the cooperation of the governments of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Ian Paisley, who was the leader of the Unionist political group, the DUP, was vehemently opposed to this and saw this relationship of the two governments as a stepping stone to a united Ireland, which he and other Unionists were deeply against. He campaigned against it with the slogan, "Dublin is just a Sunningdale away." Here's Paisley speaking where he threatens violence into the Republic of Ireland should the agreement go ahead.
We are opposed to a united Ireland. We will not have a united Ireland. I say to the Dublin government, Mr. Faulkner says it's hands across the border to Dublin. I say if they don't behave themselves in the south, it will be shots across the border.
Paisley and other Unionists set up a coordinated effort to thwart this agreement. A general strike was called, which saw Northern Ireland brought to a standstill for 14 days. Loyalist paramilitary groups helped enforce the strike by blocking off roads and intimidating workers. Then, on the third day of the strike, Loyalists detonated 4 car bombs in Dublin and Monaghan, killing 33 civilians in the Republic of Ireland. The general strike lasted 2 weeks before the agreement ultimately collapsed. Though it was a failure, elements of the Sunningdale Agreement would eventually be used in the Good Friday Agreement. In fact, the Good Friday Agreement was called by some Sunningdale for slow learners, by those critical of it. All the while, the Provisional IRA were continuing their bombing campaign in Northern Ireland, but had also started carrying out attacks in England. The Anglo-Irish Agreement was the next treaty which would attempt to restore peace to the area. It was a treaty between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland, which was signed in 1985 by British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and Irish Taoiseach Garret FitzGerald. I'll keep it brief, but the terms of the treaty stated that there would be no change in the status of the people of Northern Ireland without the consent of the majority of its citizens. It also laid the foundation for the establishment of a power-sharing government in Northern Ireland. Finally, it gave the Republic of Ireland an advisory role in the political, legal and security matters of Northern Ireland. The agreement was universally rejected by Unionists and Nationalists alike. Nationalists disagreed with it because it confirmed Northern Ireland's status as a part of the UK, and Unionists disagreed with it because of the Republic of Ireland's advisory role, and they were unhappy that they were left out of the negotiations for the terms of the agreement. Paisley and other Unionists mounted a campaign against the agreement under the name and slogan of Ulster Says No. On November 25, 1985, Paisley addressed a crowd of over 100,000 people, where he said,
"I want to ask a question today, and the question is simple. Where do the terrorists operate from? From the Irish Republic. That's where they come from. Where do the terrorists return to for sanctuary? To the Irish Republic. And yet Mrs. Thatcher tells us that that republic must have some say in our province. We say never, 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 never."
Paisley and other Unionists felt like they were being betrayed by the British government, and he went on to say that he would fight to the death to protect the Unionists in Northern Ireland. In 1986, Paisley set up the paramilitary group Ulster Resistance in direct response to the Anglo-Irish Agreement. The group worked with other Unionist paramilitary groups to successfully import arms into Northern Ireland from Lebanon, though most of the weapons were eventually seized by the RUC. Ultimately, this agreement was also unsuccessful in Northern Ireland, and it would be many years before true power sharing did occur. It did improve relations between Britain and Ireland, and many consider the agreement a stepping stone to the Good Friday Agreement, which would occur 13 years later. 1993 saw the signing of the Downing Street Declaration, which was a declaration between the Irish Taoiseach Albert Reynolds and the British Prime Minister John Major. This declaration affirmed the right of the people of Northern Ireland to decide their own future, saying that Northern Ireland would join with the Republic only if the majority of the people in Northern Ireland voted for it to be so. There was also a part of it which referred to an Irish dimension, and the principle of consent that the people of the island of Ireland had the exclusive right to solve the issues between North and South by mutual consent. This declaration also said that the political parties linked to paramilitary violence, such as Sinn Féin, could take part in the talks on the proviso that they agreed to abandon violence. There was no point having peace talks with the political parties of Northern Ireland if the people actually committing the violence weren't present. The Downing Street Declaration set the scene for what would be peace talks coming in the very near future. This would see the Provisional IRA announcing a ceasefire on August 31st, 1994, though many Unionists did not trust the ceasefire at all, and some believed that it was a tactical ceasefire instead of a genuine one. The ceasefire would also sow the seeds for discontent amongst Republican paramilitaries, which would eventually threaten the peace talks and lead to a split in the Provisional IRA, but we'll get to that later. Loyalist paramilitaries, including the UDA, UVF and Red Hand Commandos, had come together in the early 90s under an umbrella organisation, which became known as the Combined Loyalist Military Command. Then under that umbrella, they announced their own ceasefire 2 months after the IRA did, on October 13, 1994. Gusty Spence read the announcement which said, quote, "In all sincerity, we offer to the loved ones of all innocent victims over the past 25 years abject and true remorse. No words of ours will compensate for the intolerable suffering they have undergone during the conflict." Okay, so Republican and Loyalist groups have called a ceasefire, showing goodwill for a potential peace process. But there would be a long, convoluted road ahead, with more than a few bumps along the way, with the entire process resting on a knife edge at more than one time. And though unsuccessful, the two previous attempts at peace, which were the Sunningdale Agreement and the Anglo-Irish Agreement, would lay the foundations for what would eventually become the Belfast Agreement, or as it is more generally known, the Good Friday Agreement. So the stage is set. Now we need to talk about the players. There are a lot, each of them with their own wants and needs, so I'm going to go through this as clearly as possible, but it may not be in chronological order. First things first, there was the Irish Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, who was sworn in 1997. Then, in the UK, Tony Blair was sworn in as Prime Minister that same year. Over in the USA, Bill Clinton began his tenure as President in 1993, but had been watching what was going on in Northern Ireland for some time. In 1992, he proposed sending over an impartial peace envoy, but this idea was scrapped as there were fears that the move would cause tension with the British government. Then, in 1995, with the ceasefire in place, Clinton made history by becoming the first president to visit Northern Ireland. Ahern, Blair and Clinton were all in their 40s and had none of the baggage associated with the 30 years before, and there was a lot of fresh-faced hope attached to these three. Clinton then appointed American Senator George Mitchell as the United States Special Envoy for Northern Ireland. Then, in 1996, impressed by his political prowess, Mitchell was asked by the British and Irish governments to act as an impartial chair for the upcoming peace negotiations. Here's Mitchell speaking when he first took the chair. Quote, "The risk may seem high, but the reward is great. A future of peace, equality and prosperity for all the people of Northern Ireland." Some Unionists were not happy with this appointment, believing Mitchell and the US government to have a pro-Irish agenda. Inside Northern Ireland there was David Trimble, who was the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, who were a centre-right party and would be considered more moderate than the right-wing DUP. Trimble would not speak to Gerry Adams and didn't say one word to him during negotiations. Trimble's role during the peace talks would be significant, as he was instrumental in getting his party to accept the terms of the agreement, and his support of the agreement also caused him to become quite unpopular with some Unionists who believed that he was selling them out. Then there was the Progressive Unionist Party, or PUP, led by David Irvine. The PUP would be considered the political arm of the Loyalist paramilitaries, specifically the UVF. When it came to the other Loyalist paramilitary group, the UDA, Gary McMichael was part of the peace talks with the Ulster Democratic Party, or UDP. The UDP represented the political wing of the UDA. The Democratic Unionist Party, or DUP, were involved in the talks initially with Ian Paisley at the forefront, but left after Sinn Féin were readmitted, and they never returned. John Hume was the leader of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, SDLP for short. In the same way that the UUP were centre-right, the SDLP were centre-left, and slightly more moderate than the other nationalist political party, Sinn Féin. Another important person from the SDLP party was Seamus Mallon. The other nationalist party was Sinn Féin, who were perceived as the political wing of the Provisional IRA. Gerry Adams was the leader of Sinn Féin at the time, and he worked alongside Martin McGuinness, who was Sinn Féin's chief negotiator. Adams has continually denied being a member of the Provisional IRA, though a number of prominent journalists as well as ex-IRA members have claimed that he was indeed on the Army Council for a long period of time. He was careful to toe the line amongst his supporters. At one point, during the IRA ceasefire in 1995, Adams was addressing a demonstration at Belfast City Hall. A member of the crowd called out to him and said, "Bring back the IRA." In response, Adams said,
"They haven't gone away, you know."
This sentence has entered the lexicon of Northern Ireland, and Adams would go on to be heavily criticised by his opponents for it. Martin McGuinness was considered to be at the highest level of leadership in the IRA. Monica McWilliams was also an important player in the peace negotiations. She co-founded the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition political party, and it was her who realised that there was very little mention of victims in the agreement, and worked to have that addressed. The final person I'll mention in this list is Mo Mowlam, who was the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. She was part of the trade union movement for her entire career and was also a champion of women's rights as well. She was a member of the Labour Party in the UK and was an essential cog when it came to bringing Sinn Féin back into the talks in 1997. In an unprecedented move, she also went into the prisons and directly confronted loyalist prisoners in effort to persuade them to support the ongoing peace talks. Let's go back to George Mitchell. He decided to set up some ground rules that any party who participated in the peace talks must abide by. These would become known as the Mitchell Principles, which were a set of 6 ground rules agreed by the Irish and British governments and the political parties in Northern Ireland regarding participation in the talks on the future of the region. Any group or political party who broke any of these rules would not be allowed to continue with the talks. Here are the Mitchell Principles. To democratic and exclusively peaceful means of resolving political issues. To the total disarmament of all paramilitary organisations. To agree that such disarmament must be verifiable to the satisfaction of an independent commission. To renounce for themselves and to oppose any effort by others to use force or threaten to use force to influence the course of the outcome of all party negotiations. To agree to abide by the terms of any agreement reached in an all-party negotiations. And to resort to democratic and exclusively peaceful methods in trying to alter any aspect of that outcome with which they may disagree, and to urge that punishment, killings and beatings stop and to take effective steps to prevent such actions. For all of these groups to be accepted into the talks, the Mitchell Principles would need to be observed. But Sinn Féin had some issues with the terms. The IRA's 1994 ceasefire was on the proviso that Sinn Féin would be allowed into the peace talks. In 1996, the British government demanded a full IRA disarmament as a precondition for Sinn Féin entering the talks. The IRA were willing to do this eventually, but found the idea of a full disarmament unreasonable. They also probably didn't entirely trust the peace talks and didn't want to commit to giving up or destroying their weapons if there was a risk that the talks wouldn't go anywhere. They also saw this as a demand for total surrender by the British government. The reality of it was that this was a newly formed British government who were dependent on votes from the Ulster Unionist Party. And this was the government's attempt at showing good faith to the Unionists in Northern Ireland by coming down with these demands on the IRA. As a result of the demands, the Provisional IRA ended their ceasefire on February 9, 1996 with the London Docklands bombing. A powerful bomb was detonated in a truck in South Quay, London. The bomb killed 2 and injured over 100 people, as well as causing massive amounts of damage to the area. This was then followed by a second massive bomb in Manchester. This second one injured over 200 people, but luckily no one was killed, in part due to a fast response from the security services evacuating buildings. In the wake of these 2 bombings, the British government dropped its demand that the IRA completely disarm before Sinn Féin enters the peace talks, and they re-entered on September 9, 1997. To do so, they needed to stand up in front of the other groups and announce their commitment to the principles. Their readmission into the talks deeply upset some of the Unionist parties, in particular the DUP, who were led by Ian Paisley. They believed that Sinn Féin were flaunting the Mitchell Principles, and them being allowed in without completely decommissioning their weapons made a mockery of the peace process. The DUP and one other Unionist party left the talks, never to return. Meanwhile, inside the Provisional IRA, many members were deeply unhappy, believing that these talks would lead to a lot less than what they had fought for over the past 30 years. The BBC documentary, Spotlight on the Troubles, talks about an IRA convention which took place in October 1997 in Donegal, where the membership discussed the IRA's adoption of the Mitchell Principles and the overall direction that Adams and McGuinness were going. Many there opposed this peace strategy and wanted to return to violence. An opposition was shaping up, and there was a risk that those supporting the Mitchell principles could be overthrown. It went to a vote. In the BBC documentary, former IRA member Matt Tracy explained how those supporting the Mitchell principles came out on top. Quote, "They meticulously planned everything, down to who was going to vote for who, people pretending to support the other side, who had no intentions of, and they just wiped the floor with them." If that sounds a bit confusing, what he's basically saying is when it went to vote, those supporting the Mitchell principles had prevailed, had won. And for the first time in 30 years, politics prevailed over the use of violence. Not everyone was happy though, and it was the fallout from these talks that would see the provisional IRA splitting, with those dissatisfied members leaving and setting up a new paramilitary group called the Real IRA. It's September 1997. Sinn Féin are in the talks and the DUP are out. But the larger UUP, the Ulster Unionist Party, remained, with David Trimble at the helm. Trimble had a difficult job to manage, as many of those in his party were unhappy that Sinn Féin would be at the table working alongside them for peace, and he had the difficult job of convincing them it was the right choice. Many of them had lost colleagues to IRA attacks, and now they were sitting across the table from those who'd potentially ordered those attacks. David Kerr of the UUP described it well in a recent RTE documentary about the agreement, saying, quote, "I can remember the first day we went into the talks. You were bringing effectively these people into a process which we viewed them as outright combatants, and would still probably murder us if things would not work out the way they wanted to. That may seem quite extreme to listen to 25 years later. That's exactly how we felt at the time." There was another fear amongst unionists that the British government was on the cusp of cutting a deal with Sinn Féin, which would completely ignore the unionist voice. So the talks were underway, but progress was immensely slow. Every decision that would appease one side would upset the other, and a balance needed to be struck time and time again. With the issues outlined, but not much progress made, there was a break in the talks around mid-December 1997. But during that break, Billy Wright, who was the leader of the paramilitary group the Loyalist Volunteer Force, or LVF, was shot dead by the Republican paramilitary group, the INLA. This was a stark reminder how close the violence was to spilling out of the prisons and onto the streets again. And briefly, the violence began to resurge again, culminating on March 3rd, 1998. The LVF were out for revenge after the killing of their leader, Billy Wright. Two friends, 34-year-old Philip Allen and 24-year-old Damien Traynor, were having a pint together in the small village of Points Pass in Northern Ireland. It was a mixed village, with Allen being a Catholic and Traynor a Protestant. Allen had just gotten engaged and asked Traynor to be his best man, and the two were chatting about it, when two masked gunmen burst in through the doors of the pub and shouted, "Get down, you bastards," to the people in the pub. 12 shots were fired, killing 2 people, Allen and Traynor. It's believed that this was a random attack targeting the Catholic population. Shortly after this, one of the Loyalist parties, the UDP, left the talks just before they were about to be expelled. This was after the Ulster Freedom Fighters admitted responsibility for a number of sectarian killings which had taken place. The UDP was at the talks, so they were to be expelled until the UFF committed to stop killing people. This attack sent shockwaves through the peace talks. To show unification and support, Seamus Mallon of the SDLP and David Trimble of the UUP visited the village where the attacks occurred and visited the wakes of both families. It was a significant moment of unity between the two sides. They would not allow violence to win. We're now at March 1998, and these peace talks have been dragging on and on for around 3 years, but it was becoming quite difficult to see an end in sight. George Mitchell realised this, and coupled with the fact that he had a son born back in the US and that he, quote, wanted to see him before he went away to college, he decided to set a deadline, where there would be 2 weeks of intense negotiations, and then a decision had to be made by Holy Thursday, aka the 9th of April 1998. It all rested on the next 2 weeks. If this fell apart, it could be another decade before a peace agreement was back on the table. This had to work, and the pressure was felt by all parties. Negotiations focused on the establishing of a framework for the creation of institutions across 3 strands. Just a quick side note, this is a really mammoth topic, and I'm really just scratching the surface, so forgive me if I don't spend too long on one topic. The first strand focused on inter-party politics in Northern Ireland and how they would work. 2 institutions were to be established, the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Northern Ireland Executive. The Assembly is essentially the government of Northern Ireland, and I'll address this more later. The second strand focused on relationships between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. This allowed for the setting up of councils and associations which would work together and in some cases create and develop common policies which would be rolled out across the island of Ireland. You could see how the likes of Brexit could affect something like this if the Republic of Ireland has to answer to European guidelines and Northern Ireland doesn't. The third strand focused on East-West relationships, meaning relationships between Ireland and Great Britain. It was important that there was cooperation at all levels between both governments. But there were some significant sticking points that needed to be addressed in the Republic of Ireland's constitution, in the forms of Articles 2 and 3. Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution of the Republic of Ireland were problematic. They dated back to 1937 and basically said that the national territory of the Republic of Ireland was the entire island of Ireland. Unionists wanted it changed. Bertie Ahern was happy to amend the constitution on the proviso that there was a North-South Ministerial Council created, which would improve ties and relations between Northern Ireland and the Republic. If his terms were agreed upon, he would take the amendment to the Irish people, who would then have a referendum to vote on it. It's a fairly large amendment, but the gist of what was changed is that the birthright of all the people of Northern Ireland to identify themselves and be accepted as Irish or British, or both, as they may so choose. The changed Article 3 of the Irish Constitution basically said that if a united Ireland were to ever occur, the distinct cultural identity of Unionists would also be respected. These amendments to the Irish Constitution would be the first time that the Irish government has officially recognised Northern Ireland as a part of the United Kingdom. Now, back to the Good Friday Agreement. It recognised 2 things. For one, the majority of the people in Northern Ireland wished to remain a part of the United Kingdom, but also that a substantial section of the people of Northern Ireland and the majority of the people of the island of Ireland wished to bring about a united Ireland. The agreement would leave the future of Northern Ireland open-ended, and if the day came where the majority of the people of Northern Ireland wanted to join with the Republic of Ireland, a referendum would be held. So what were the other issues that needed to be addressed in this agreement? Well, there are a lot of issues that needed to be managed, and George Mitchell explained in the RTE documentary that after a year and a half of discussions, the group still couldn't agree on what the issues were that needed to be resolved. But with the days winding down, a few key issues were at the forefront of the debate, and one of the largest ones was the decommissioning of weapons. The groups taking part in the talks, who had links to paramilitary groups, needed to agree that all paramilitary groups would do everything in their power and use any influence that they may have to decommission their arms within 2 years of the signing of the agreement. This ended up taking significantly longer than 2 years, but I'll get to that. And hopefully, after a few years, an independent commission would come into Northern Ireland and have an inspection to prove if all sides had actually put their weapons beyond use. Another aspect of the talks was normalisation. After 3 decades of violence, Northern Ireland was a country full of army barracks, lookout posts and other military installations. So it was important to prioritise the closing down of these installations, as long as the threat was significantly reduced. It was also important to remove the emergency powers that the British government had, as that could gradually be passed on over to the Northern Irish Assembly. Then there was policing. Since their inception in 1922, the Northern Irish Police Force, the RUC, had been overwhelmingly Protestant, leading to accusations of one-sided policing and sectarianism against the nationalist community. A new police force would be established, the PSNI, which would replace the RUC and be more inclusive than its predecessor. There were also things that were put in place which would allow for a better relationship between criminal courts in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland. The release of prisoners was easily the most controversial part of the entire agreement. And it basically said that all paramilitary prisoners sentenced before the signing of the agreement would be granted a license of release. This license could be revoked at any time, so it was important that the individuals released did not return to violence. Sinn Féin really wanted its paramilitary prisoners to be released, alongside loyalist prisoners, but it's something that the Unionists were very set against, and required a significant amount of negotiating to get to a place where all sides were happy. With days to go before the deadline, drafts of the final agreement were sent around to all parties, but Trimble and the UUP were not yet satisfied. They believed that the agreement was still too green, as in too much in favour of nationalists, and relationships between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and that it was still not a fair and balanced agreement. The Irish government was reluctant to change their position, and Bertie insisted on getting the North-South Ministerial Council. It was now Tuesday and 2 days to go until the deadline, with the talks firmly deadlocked. Ahern and Blair travelled up to the talks to see if they could get things across the line. And it was around this time that Tony Blair delivered his Hand of History speech.
A day like today, I mean, it's not a day for sort of sound bites, really. We can leave those at home, but I feel the hand of history upon our shoulder in respect of this. I really do. And I just think we need to acknowledge that and respond to it. Now, maybe it's impossible to find a way through. Maybe even with the best faith in the world, you can't do it. But it's right to try. So I'm here to try.
The day of the deadline arrived, Thursday, April 9th, and things were still uncertain. It had been decided that there would be a power-sharing government set up where John Hume of the SDLP and David Trimble of the UUP would lead the country together. But when it came to decommissioning and the release of prisoners, there was still no clear answer. The talks continued all night long as Thursday went into Friday. At the same time, outside of the talks, there were protests, and David Trimble was heckled by Unionists who believed that he was selling them out. Then, in the early hours of the morning of Good Friday, Ian Paisley appeared and tried to hold a press conference outside the venue, condemning the talks. In a rare turn of events, he was actually heckled by Unionists who supported the talks. He was called a dinosaur and yesterday's man. As the talks continued on, Sinn Féin were negotiating with Ahern and Blair, looking to secure a time frame for the release of prisoners. They had agreed on prisoner release, but Sinn Féin wanted to put a number on it. They wanted everyone released within 1 year. Mo Mowlem then brought this to Gary McMichael and David Irvine to ask them their thoughts on loyalist prisoners, if they would agree to a 1 year time frame for releases. It took a while, but eventually a figure of 2 years was settled upon. The prisoner release was an extremely painful pill to swallow. I recently watched the TV show Derry Girls, and one of the characters grapples with the ethics of someone who committed a murder being released. It conveyed the complexity and the confusion of the period quite well. Again, the agreement needed those committing the violence to be on board. So though it did receive criticism for not having enough focus on the victims, there was a larger focus on stopping the immediate violence. As dawn approached on Good Friday, April 10th, there was a palpable sense of tension and uncertainty in the air. The UUP were split. Many of its members felt that the agreement still wasn't enough, especially when it came to the decommissioning of weapons. But the agreement had more or less been completed, so it was too late for it to be amended. So a side letter was written by Blair to try and address the concerns of the Unionists. Geoffrey Donaldson was a member of the UUP at the time, as was Arlene Foster. They weren't happy that there wasn't a specific declaration from the IRA that they would decommission their weapons, and felt that there was a chance that the IRA could revoke their ceasefire, like they did in 1996. The UUP decided to vote on it, and though it was extremely tight, support for the agreement was upheld. For Geoffrey Donaldson and Arlene Foster, the seeds of discontent were sown, which would eventually see them resigning from the party itself and joining the DUP a few years later. Once the UUP had secured a yes vote on the agreement, David Trimble put a call to George Mitchell saying, "We're ready to do business." George then called an all-party meeting at 5 p.m. And then it was done. In front of the media, the group gathered together and George Mitchell went around to all the parties asking a yes-no question if they supported the agreement. David Trimble was eighth in line, and there was a slight fear that he might say anything but yes. But he said yes, and for the first time in decades, all parties had come to an agreement. There were hugs all round as speeches were held. But what was the actual name of the agreement? Bertie Ahern recalls that when it was finished and typed up, it was presented to him as the Belfast Agreement, something which he had no say in. He then chimed in, as he would have liked to have been consulted on the name of the agreement, saying it should be called the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Then one of the officials present in the room suggested naming it after the day that was in it, Good Friday. It's unclear exactly who called it what it was, but 25 years on, it has continually been referred to as both the Belfast Agreement and the Good Friday Agreement. But around the world, it's probably better known as the Good Friday Agreement. Okay, so the parties have agreed on the agreement, and now would need to go to a referendum to the people of Northern Ireland, who would decide yes or no on the Good Friday Agreement. Friday, the 6th of May, was the day the referendum would take place. On the same day, the Republic of Ireland would also hold a referendum to amend Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution. The vote in the Republic of Ireland was a fairly certain affair, but it was unclear exactly what the result would be in Northern Ireland and what position David Trimble would take during the campaign. The big question was, would enough Unionists support this agreement? Ian Paisley still had plenty of support and was naturally good at stoking the flames, especially on the issues of decommissioning and prisoner releases. All the parties had 6 weeks to campaign for the Northern Irish public to vote yes on the agreement. Vote yes, it's the way ahead was one such slogan used. But the no side was loud, striking fear that the streets of Northern Ireland would be full of terrorists after 24 months. Things weren't exactly helped when some ex-paramilitary prisoners appeared at a Sinn Féin event called an Ard Feis in the Republic of Ireland and were given a hero's welcome. The Balcombe Street Gang were an IRA cell based in London in the 70s who took part in around 40 bombing and gun attacks. 4 members were at the Sinn Féin event after having served 23 years of a life sentence. They had been temporarily released as a sign of good faith. But in the eyes of some tentative Unionists, seeing perceived murderers given a hero's welcome didn't exactly inspire a yes vote. The same happened on the other side too, as Michael Stone was temporarily released to attend a loyalist rally. Michael Stone was the man who threw a grenade and then opened fire on the crowd during the burial of the Gibraltar Three. 3 mourners were killed in this attack. A concert was also organised by the Yes side, who were trying to do as much as they could to secure younger votes, which saw the famous Irish band U2 come and play. At one point during the show, Bono called up David Trimble and John Hume, and the two appeared from either side of the stage, shook hands, and then Bono held up their hands in the air, to a jubilant cheer from the crowd. The agreement needed a majority vote to pass, and in the end, 71% voted in favour of the agreement. It was a wonderful moment, full of hope for the people of Northern Ireland, for the first time in a long time.
Oscar 7-0 from Oscar. Roger, will you get 7-1 and go short of the courthouse? I would suggest well short of the courthouse. There's a bomb warning in from about 3 different locations. Take a wander up, checking for cars that seem to be heavily laden down. It's supposed to be £500. Blue 3, Oscar 17. Blue 3, Oscar 17, Blue 3, send over. Roger, could you...
Then, just 4 months later, 29 people were killed in the Omagh bomb, carried out by the real IRA. They opposed the Good Friday Agreement and wanted to continue a campaign of violence. The destruction and devastation caused by the Omagh bombing was immense. And coming just 4 months after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, made everyone wonder, were things going to slip again? But they didn't, and peace prevailed. In the years following the agreement, things were set in motion. Barracks were dismantled, and the British Army prepared to leave. In total, 428 paramilitary prisoners were released. And I couldn't get an actual figure, but of that number, very few ever ended up returning to prison. I did find one source saying that 2/3 of prisoners released under the agreement were unemployed 20 years later. Whether this is related to socioeconomics or to previous paramilitary activity is unclear. Decommissioning was a long and drawn-out process. The initial agreement was that all paramilitary groups would decommission their weapons by May 2000. When May arrived, the Provisional IRA were reluctant to disarm and didn't do so until August 2001. Then, in 2009, the UVF and Red Hand Commandos finally announced that they had disarmed. Politically, there was a bit of a shift as well. From 1998 to 2003, centrist parties like the UUP and SDLP lost majority rule in favour of the DUP and Sinn Féin. Those opposed to the agreement who left the UUP, such as Arlene Foster and Jeffrey Donaldson, found a home in the DUP, and both went on to lead the party. As of writing, Jeffrey Donaldson is the current leader of the DUP. And over the past 24 years, the DUP and Sinn Féin have had many issues working together in Stormont. The new Northern Ireland Assembly, unofficially known as Stormont, was established in 1999. And perhaps the biggest problem in the political sphere in Northern Ireland is that when two sides fight, they can completely collapse the government and bring things to a standstill. And this has happened many times over the past 24 years. In 2002, Sinn Féin's offices were raided by the police, who were investigating allegations of intelligence gathering on behalf of the IRA by members of the party's support staff. As a result of this, unionist parties withdrew from government and Assembly wasn't restored until 2007. There was 10 years of working together, and then in 2017 there was a renewable heat incentive scandal that the DUP found themselves embroiled in. To protest this, Sinn Féin withdrew from the Assembly, which was eventually restored in 2020. Then, in 2022, the DUP refused to work alongside Sinn Féin, protesting against the Northern Ireland Protocol. As of writing in March 2023, the Assembly has still not returned. That means, since its inception 24 years ago, the Northern Ireland Assembly has been out of operation for nearly 9 of those years, much to the frustration of the people in Northern Ireland who want a functioning government which won't collapse when one side disagrees with the other. There has, however, been a lot of growth in the middle, in a party known as the Alliance Party, who are currently the 3rd largest party in Northern Ireland. The party describes themselves as being neither unionist nor nationalist. John Hume and David Trimble would go on to receive a joint Nobel Prize for their role in the peace talks. Many have said that David Trimble had the heaviest load to carry during this period. He had to campaign for a yes vote while protecting unionist values and also managing a party that was starting to split up, as well as maintaining a relationship with the nationalists. So 25 years after the signing of the agreement, we do still have peace. And though there certainly are problems facing the people in Northern Ireland today, they are very different problems than those 3 decades ago. In the RTE documentary, George Mitchell brought up one statistic that shows how much things have changed. In the 30 years prior to the agreement being signed, approximately 3,500 people were killed. But in the 25 years since signing, that figure is 145. It's not perfect, but it's far better than it was. On the next episode, I'll be sitting down with Bertie Ahern, who will describe to me what it was like to be part of these historic talks.
If you look at the 74 collapse and they didn't meet again until 85, 85 collapse and it was 97, so you're probably gone for another decade. And that was a big worry. That was my big concern. And how bad would this get? Just what would happen on the streets.
That's it from me. Thanks, and see you next time.